In the untamed wilderness of the Oklahoma Territory, a fatal mistake is about to teach 5 outlaws the true meaning of terror. When they rode onto Samuel Blackhawk's farm, all they saw was a solitary Cherokee tending his crops. The sound of their laughter echoed across the fields as they slapped him around, believing they'd found an easy target. They didn't know that for generations, his bloodline had produced the deadliest warriors of the Cherokee Nation, silent hunters who could track a deer for days and vanish like smoke in the wind. As the sun sets on their act of disrespect, these outlaws are about to learn why the old-timers speak of Cherokee warriors in whispers. They came looking for easy prey, but now they're about to become the hunted. In the darkness of night, an ancestral warrior's spirit awakens, and one man will remind them why you never mistake silence for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn broke over the Oklahoma Territory like a whispered prayer, painting the sky in strokes of amber and rose. Samuel Blackhawk's calloused hands moved with practiced precision as he sharpened his hoe against a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping echoing across his 20 acres of farmland. The morning dew still clung to the corn stalks, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze that carried the sweet scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadow. Each morning followed the same ritual, one that Samuel had maintained for the past 15 years, since inheriting the land from his father. He would rise before the sun, check the perimeter of his property, a habit many attributed to simple farmers' diligence, though few understood its true purpose, and tend to his crops with the same patience and attention he once devoted to tracking game through the dense forests with his grandfather. The local townspeople of Miller's Creek had grown accustomed to his quiet presence at the weekly markets, where he sold his vegetables and corn. They appreciated his gentle demeanor, the way he would lift heavy crates for the elderly Mrs. Patterson without being asked, or how he taught the young Thompson boys to identify edible herbs growing wild in the territory. Some whispered about his past, about the proud Cherokee bloodline that ran through his veins, but most were content to know him as the reliable farmer who never failed to deliver the sweetest corn in 3 counties. But there was more to Samuel than met the eye. It showed in the way he moved, silent as a shadow despite his imposing frame, in how his dark eyes constantly scanned the horizon while he worked, and in the precise arrangement of his tools, each one maintained with the care usually reserved. For weapons, these subtle signs went unnoticed by most, but they spoke to a lifetime of training that ran deeper than farming techniques. Today, as he worked his way through the cornfield, Samuel's hands remembered other lessons: the weight of a tomahawk, the tension of a bowstring, the art of moving unseen through dense undergrowth. His grandfather's voice still echoed in his mind. "Our ways are not lost, just sleeping. Keep them close, for you never know when they must awaken." A crow's sharp call drew his attention skyward. Samuel watched it circle overhead, remembering how his grandfather taught him to read the birds' patterns, to understand their warnings. The crow called again, and Samuel's fingers instinctively tightened around the hoe's handle. Something felt different about this morning, a tension in the air that spoke to instincts honed by generations of warriors before him. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel methodically checked his fence lines, noting the fresh tracks in the soft earth. Deer, rabbit, and something else. Horse tracks, fresh ones heading toward town, more visitors to Miller's Creek, not unusual with the territory growing busier each year. Yet something about the depth and pattern of the tracks made him pause. 5 horses, riding heavy, their riders likely armed, the kind of tracks his grandfather had taught him to watch for, back when the territory was wilder and dangers more frequent. Samuel straightened, rolling his broad shoulders as he surveyed his land. The corn was nearly ready for harvest, the pumpkin patch was thriving, and the herb garden his mother had started years ago continued to flourish under his care. This quiet life he'd built, this peace he'd found in working the land, it was everything his parents had hoped for him. Yet even as he returned to his chores, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was about to be tested. In town, they knew him as the farmer who rarely spoke unless spoken to, who attended church on Sundays and helped build the new schoolhouse last spring. What they didn't know was that beneath his farmer's calluses lay warrior's hands, and behind his peaceful demeanor lived a spirit that had never forgotten the old ways. Samuel Blackhawk had chosen this quiet life, but he had never stopped being what he was born to be. A guardian of his people's traditions, a keeper of ancient skills that some might soon wish had been forgotten. As Samuel stoked the evening fire in his humble cabin, memories flooded back like autumn leaves carried on a twilight breeze. His weathered hands traced the intricate carvings on his grandfather's ceremonial pipe, each groove a story, each pattern a lesson learned beneath the ancient oaks that still stood guard over their ancestral training grounds. "Remember, grandson," his grandfather's voice echoed from the past, clear as mountain water. "Our ways are not about seeking conflict, but about being ready when conflict seeks us." Those words had been spoken on Samuel's 13th summer, as the old warrior taught him to walk without disturbing a single leaf, to read the wind's messages, and to understand the sacred responsibility that came with their heritage. The training had been relentless. Dawn breaks spent learning to track deer through morning mist, afternoons dedicated to mastering the art of the silent kill, and nights spent learning to navigate by stars and shadow. His grandfather would often say, "The land speaks to those who listen, and it protects those who honor it." Sheriff Thomas Miller had been one of the few to recognize the warrior beneath the farmer's calm exterior. Their friendship had formed gradually, built on mutual respect and understanding. The sheriff had served with Cherokee scouts during his army days and knew the depth of their skills. "Your kind of quiet ain't the same as most men's," Miller had once told him over coffee. "It's the kind that comes from knowing you don't need to prove nothing to nobody." Samuel pulled a worn leather pouch from beneath a floorboard, another of his grandfather's teachings: keep your treasures hidden, but within reach. Inside lay the obsidian knife his grandfather had crafted, its edge still sharp enough to split a hair. The blade had been passed down through 5 generations of warriors, each adding their own prayers to its spirit. The memories shifted to his final test, when his grandfather had tracked him through the mountains for 3 days. Samuel had used every skill he'd learned, moving like mist through the trees, leaving false trails, using the terrain to his advantage. In the end, he hadn't just evaded his grandfather. He'd managed to circle behind and track him instead. The old man's proud smile had said more than words ever could. "You carry our traditions now," his grandfather had said that night, passing him the sacred pipe. "Not to use them lightly, but to keep them alive. Peace is our way, but so is protecting what's sacred. Land, family, honor, these are worth fighting for. But remember, grandson, a true warrior knows that the most powerful weapon is patience." Those lessons had served Samuel well over the years. They helped him build this life, this farm, this place of peace. When others saw only a quiet farmer, he knew he was living as his grandfather had taught him, like a blade sheathed but sharp, ready if needed but content to remain at rest. The dying fire's light caught the edge of another hidden treasure, his grandfather's tomahawk hanging in the shadows behind his work shirts. Samuel rarely looked at it these days, but he still maintained it with the same care he'd been taught. Its weight was familiar in his hands, its balance perfect, its edge kept as keen as his memories. A cool breeze stirred the cabin's air, carrying with it the scent of sage from his mother's garden. Samuel closed his eyes, offering a quiet prayer of thanks to the spirits of his ancestors. In the distance, an owl called, once, twice, 3 times. His grandfather had taught him that 3 calls were a warning, a message from the night itself. "Nature speaks its own truth," the old man would say. "We must simply learn to listen." Samuel returned the pipe to its resting place, but the memories remained close, like shadows at sunset. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight, in the quiet of his cabin, he was both the farmer he had chosen to be and the warrior he had been born to be. His grandfather's final words of training echoed in his mind. The greatest strength lies in knowing when to use strength at all. The Saturday market in Miller's Creek buzzed with its usual activity, but an undercurrent of tension rippled through the morning air. Samuel noticed it as soon as he began unloading his wagon, the way conversations would drop to whispers, how mothers kept their children closer, the nervous glances thrown toward the saloon at the end of the dusty street. Sheriff Miller appeared at Samuel's stand as he arranged his corn and vegetables, his badge catching the morning sun. "Heard anything about some new faces in the territory?" the lawman asked quietly, picking up a tomato and pretending to examine it. "5 horses," Samuel replied, just as casually. "Passed near my land yesterday, riding heavy, armed." He didn't mention how he'd spent the evening checking his own weapons, oiling the old Winchester rifle his father had left him, or testing the drawer of his grandfather's bow. The sheriff nodded grimly. "They hit the Watson place 2 counties over, left old man Watson with a broken arm and helped themselves to everything worth taking. Been working their way through the territory, getting bolder with each stop." Samuel's hands stilled over his produce. The Watson farm wasn't unlike his own. Isolated, productive, an easy target for those with cruel intentions. His grandfather's voice whispered in his memory, "The wind brings news before the storm." Throughout the morning, Samuel gathered fragments of information like falling leaves. The Outlaws were led by a man named Jack Hawkins, known for his particular distaste for Indian farmers. They'd burned a Cherokee family's barn in the next county, laughing as the flames lit up the night sky. 3 of his gang had served time for robbery and worse, but Hawkins himself had always slipped away from justice like smoke through fingers. As the market day wound down, Samuel made his preparations. He traded some of his vegetables for extra ammunition at the general store, bought new rope from the chandler, and visited the blacksmith to have his tools sharpened, though both men knew he wasn't planning to use them just for farming. Back at his farm, Samuel began transforming his land into what his grandfather had called a warrior's garden. He adjusted the simple traps he always kept maintained, snares and tripwires that usually kept coyotes and wolves away from his chickens. Now they would serve a different purpose. Each one was carefully hidden, but placed where an experienced tracker would expect prey to pass. Near sunset, he walked his property's boundaries, marking the easy approaches that raiders might use. The creek bed that ran along the western edge, the dense thicket to the north that offered concealment, the gentle slope to the east that would tempt mounted men. Each location was noted and prepared. Samuel buried markers that only he would recognize, positioned fallen logs to create natural barriers, and cleared subtle paths that would lead unwary trespassers exactly where he wanted them to go. Inside his cabin, he moved his bed against the back wall, away from the windows. The loose floorboard that had always held his grandfather's sacred items now also concealed extra ammunition. He positioned his father's rifle where it could cover the front door, while keeping his grandfather's bow and tomahawk within easy reach. Night fell. Samuel sat on his porch, appearing to anyone watching as nothing more than a farmer taking his evening rest. But his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, watching for dust clouds or the reflection of afternoon sun on metal. His ears remained tuned to the sounds of his land, the birds, the wind in the corn, the distant lowing of cattle. Any change in these natural rhythms would tell him when trouble was approaching. The moon rose full and bright, casting long shadows across his fields. Samuel thought of Sheriff Miller's warning, of the Watson family's suffering, of the burned Cherokee barn. His grandfather had taught him that a warrior's strength lay not in seeking violence, but in being prepared when violence sought him. Tonight, as he made his final preparations, Samuel Blackhawk was both farmer and warrior, a guardian of his land who hoped for peace, but was ready for war. The sun had barely passed its peak when Samuel heard them coming. 5 horses, their hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth of the trail leading to his farm. He kept working, his hoe rising and falling in steady rhythm among the cornstalks, but his senses were sharp as a drawn blade. The riders didn't bother to mask their approach. Their raucous laughter and casual conversation carried across the field like thunder before a storm. Jack Hawkins led the group, his black duster coated with trail dust, a silver-plated revolver gleaming at his hip. His face bore the weathered creases of a man who'd spent too many years squinting into the sun with malice in his heart. Behind him rode his gang, the Tanner brothers, known for their quick tempers and quicker triggers. Mexican Joe, whose knife work had left scars across 3 territories, and Slim Jenkins, the youngest but perhaps the cruelest of the lot. "Well, look what we got here, boys," Hawkins called out, reining his horse to a stop at the edge of Samuel's field. One of them civilized Indians, playing at being a farmer. The others chuckled, spreading out in a loose semicircle as Samuel straightened slowly, keeping his eyes down, his grip relaxed but ready on the hoe handle. "Fine crop you got." "Growing," Hawkins continued, swinging down from his saddle. His spurs jingled as he walked closer, boots crushing the tender shoots Samuel had planted just weeks before. "Must be good land. Shame to see it wasted on a redskin." Samuel remained silent, his grandfather's teachings echoing in his mind. Let them show their nature first. The patient warrior sees his enemy's weakness before striking. He could feel the outlaws' eyes on him, watching for fear, looking for any excuse to escalate the violence they carried in their hearts. "What's wrong?" "Chief," Tanner, the elder brother, sneered, "cat got your tongue." "Or maybe you just don't speak American." He stepped closer, tobacco juice staining his unkempt beard. "I speak well enough," Samuel replied quietly, his voice carrying the calm of deep water. "And this is private property." The gang's laughter cut through the afternoon air like knife blades. Mexican Joe spat in the dirt. "Private property," he says. "You hear that, Jack? The Injun thinks he owns something." Hawkins moved with the casual arrogance of a man used to taking what he wanted. His hand shot out, grabbing Samuel's shirt front. "Listen here, Chief. This here's civilization now, and civilization's got rules. Rule number 1 is..." His other hand whipped across Samuel's face in a stinging slap. "You show respect to your betters." The slap echoed across the field like a gunshot. Samuel's head turned with the blow, but his eyes never left Hawkins. Blood trickled from his split lip, dropping onto the rich soil below. In that moment, something shifted in the air, subtle, like the first stirring of leaves before a tornado. "Maybe." "We ought to teach him all the rules, Jack," Slim Jenkins called out, fingering his gun belt. "Seems like this one's a slow learner," Hawkins grinned, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco. "Good idea, Slim. Been a while since we had us some real entertainment." He shoved Samuel backward, watching with satisfaction as the farmer stumbled slightly. "How about it, Chief? Ready for your education?" Samuel straightened slowly, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made even Hawkins pause. "You have until sundown to leave my land." The outlaw's laughter rang out again, but this time there was an edge to it, a hint of uncertainty at the calm certainty in Samuel's voice. Hawkins recovered quickly, his hand dropping to his gun. "Or what, Redskin? You'll call down the spirits on us?" "Sundown," Samuel repeated, turning his back on them and walking toward his cabin. Behind him, he could hear them shouting threats, making promises of what they'd do when they returned. But he didn't look back. He had preparations to make, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Inside his cabin, Samuel stood before the old chest his grandfather had given him, its wood worn smooth by generations of reverent hands. The sun's rays slanted through the window, painting long shadows across the floor as he opened it with deliberate care. Inside lay the items he'd hoped would remain untouched. The war paint made from sacred herbs and earth, the leather strips for binding his hair, and the ceremonial sash woven with symbols of his clan's protection. His split lip throbbed with each heartbeat, but the pain only served to sharpen his focus. The taste of blood in his mouth brought back his grandfather's words about the warrior's path. Blood spilled in anger poisons the spirit. Blood spilled in defense of what's sacred feeds the ancestors' strength. With practiced movements, Samuel began the ritual of preparation. He stripped off his farmer's clothes and washed himself with water from the creek, speaking the ancient prayers of purification. Each movement was measured, each prayer a step further from the peaceful farmer and closer to the warrior his grandfather had trained him to be. The decision to walk the warrior's path is not made in anger, his grandfather had taught him. It is made in the quiet moments when the spirit speaks clearest. Samuel listened now, hearing not just his grandfather's wisdom, but the voices of all his ancestors. The land itself seemed to speak, in the rustle of corn leaves, in the cry of hawks overhead, in the very breath of the wind. From another hidden compartment, Samuel retrieved small pouches of herbs, medicines his grandfather had taught him to prepare, some for healing, others for strength, and a few whose purposes were known only to warriors. He placed them carefully in a leather bag alongside strips of dried meat and a water skin. A warrior must be prepared for a long hunt. The outlaws would return. Of this he had no doubt. Their kind always did, believing that their numbers and their cruelty made them strong. They would come expecting to find a frightened farmer, perhaps hoping he'd already fled. Instead, they would face something their nightmares had only whispered about. Samuel unwrapped his grandfather's bow from its oiled cloth. The wood seemed to hum under his fingers, recognizing the touch of a warrior's hands. Each arrow he selected had been crafted with prayers and purpose, their fletching taken from eagles that had died naturally, their shafts blessed with songs of truth and justice. As the sun crept lower, Samuel painted his face with the traditional markings of his peoples. Warriors. Each line held meaning, protection, wisdom, strength, and the sacred duty of a protector. In his mirror's reflection, he watched the transformation. The peaceful farmer receded, and in his place emerged something far older, something that had lived in his blood since before his grandfather's grandfather walked these lands. He spoke the final prayer, the one his grandfather had taught him for moments when war became unavoidable. Great Spirit, I do not seek this fight, but I accept it. Guide my hands to protect what is sacred. Let my actions bring honor to my ancestors. And if I must take life, let it be done with a clear heart and swift mercy. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of night. Samuel could almost hear the outlaws gathering their courage in whatever hole they'd crawled into, probably drinking whiskey and boasting about how they would handle one lone Indian farmer. They had no idea that their first mistake, their fatal mistake, had been assuming he was alone. A Cherokee warrior is never alone. He carries with him the strength of his ancestors, the wisdom of his elders, and the sacred responsibility of protecting the land. Samuel stepped onto his porch just as the sun touched the horizon. He knocked an arrow to his bow, its familiar weight, an extension of his arm. Soon, very soon, Jack Hawkins and his gang would learn why the old ones spoke of Cherokee warriors in whispered tones, and why some lessons were taught only once. Darkness fell like a velvet blanket over the Oklahoma Territory, bringing with it the chorus of night creatures, crickets chirping their evening songs, owls calling from ancient perches. But Samuel heard something else, the muffled approach of horses being led slowly through the creek bed to the west of his property. The outlaws were trying to be quiet, but to his trained ears, they might as well have been beating war drums. The moon cast enough light for Samuel to see them dismounting at the edge of his cornfield, their silhouettes dark against the silver-kissed stalks. They'd split into two groups, 3 men approaching from the creek, 2 others circling toward the barn. Just as he'd expected, his grandfather's voice whispered in his memory, "The predictable enemy is already half defeated." Slim, Jenkins, and Mexican Joe crept toward the barn, their confidence growing with each step that didn't bring resistance. Samuel watched from the shadows of his corn, silent as death itself, as they reached the barn's entrance. The door creaked. Open, a sound that would mask the whisper of his bowstring. The arrow took Jenkins in the shoulder, spinning him around with the force of the impact. His scream shattered the night's peace, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Before Mexican Joe could even draw his gun, a second arrow pinned his gun hand to the barn door. The outlaw's curse was cut short by a third arrow that thudded into the wood beside his head, a warning that the next one wouldn't miss. "Slim? Joe?" Hawkins' voice carried from the creek bed, tension evident in his tone. "What the hell's going on over there?" Samuel had already moved, ghosting through the corn like a shadow. The stalks barely whispered at his passing. A skill, learned from countless hours of training. "Your men are alive." His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying on the night wind. "But they won't be joining you tonight." The Tanner brothers opened fire blindly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes destroying their night vision. Samuel counted the shots, 6 from each revolver. When the echoes died away, only the sound of heavy breathing remained. "Show yourself, you red devil," the elder Tanner shouted, fumbling to reload his gun with shaking hands. "Fight like a man." "I am fighting like my people fight." Samuel's voice drifted from a new direction. "You wanted to teach me rules? Let me teach you some of mine." A thrown rock clattered in the darkness to their left, drawing more panicked shots. In their fear, they didn't notice the tripwire until the younger Tanner brother went down hard, his knee cracking against a carefully placed log. His howl of pain joined Jenkins' whimpers from the barn. Hawkins was smarter than his men, already, backing toward the creek bed. "We can talk about this," he called out, his earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. "Make a deal, maybe?" "I gave you your chance at sundown," Samuel replied, now somehow behind them. The older Tanner spun, firing his last bullet at a shadow that was already gone. "You chose to learn the hard way." A whispered prayer in Cherokee preceded the next arrow, which found the elder Tanner's gun hand with surgical precision. The outlaw's weapon fell into the dirt as he clutched his bleeding hand to his chest, cursing in terrified rage. Hawkins broke then, running for the creek bed where they'd left the horses. Samuel let him go. The night was young, and a proper hunt couldn't be rushed. He emerged from the shadows near the wounded Tanner brothers, his painted face catching the moonlight, making him appear more spirit than man. "Tell your boss," he said quietly to the brothers, binding their wounds with practiced ease, "that this is only the beginning. Tonight, he learns what it means to wake a sleeping warrior." The brothers said nothing, their eyes wide with fear as they stared at the man they'd so foolishly underestimated. In the distance, they could hear Hawkins' horse galloping away, carrying their leader into the darkness that Samuel had already claimed as his hunting ground. The night wind carried the cry of a lone wolf, a sound that seemed to mock the outlaw's failure and herald the true battle yet to come. Samuel moved through the darkness like a spirit, each step placed with the precision of a lifetime's training. He had secured the wounded outlaws in his barn, treating their injuries enough to ensure they'd survive, but leaving them bound and unable to interfere. Now, the real hunt could begin. The night air carried stories to his trained senses, the sharp scent of gun oil from Hawkins' hasty retreat, the subtle disturbance of dew-laden grass where feet had passed, the distant sound of panicked horses. His grandfather had taught him to read such signs as easily as others read books. The land remembers every step taken upon it. Learn its language, and you will never lose your prey. Mexican Joe had managed to free himself from the barn door, but left a clear trail of blood droplets heading east, toward the dense thicket where they'd likely made their camp. Samuel followed the sign for 50 yards before the trail suddenly vanished. A smile touched his painted features. The outlaw had remembered enough of his own tracking skills to try covering his path. "Even a wounded wolf can bite," his grandfather's voice reminded him. Samuel circled the area carefully, noting the broken twigs and disturbed leaves that told the true story of Mexican Joe's passage. The outlaw was injured but dangerous, moving. Deeper into the territory Samuel knew best. A twig snapped in the darkness ahead, too heavy to be wildlife, too careless to be Hawkins. Samuel nocked an arrow, moving like smoke between the trees. Mexican Joe's ragged breathing gave away his position, along with the metallic click of a revolver being cocked. "I know you're out there, you Cherokee devil." The outlaw's voice wavered between pain and fury. "Been hunted by better than you." Samuel's reply came from the shadows, his voice carrying on the night wind. "No, you haven't." He moved again, silent as owl's wings, circling his prey. "But you're about to learn the difference." Mexican Joe fired. Into the darkness, the flash temporarily blinding him. The bullet passed harmlessly through empty air as Samuel's arrow found its mark, piercing the outlaw's other hand. The gun fell, and Joe's scream echoed through the trees. "That's for the barn you burned," Samuel said, emerging from the shadows like a vengeful spirit. "The Cherokee family you tormented? They had children inside? Remember their screams?" Joe tried to reach for his knife with bleeding hands, but Samuel's next arrow pinned his sleeve to a tree trunk. "Please," the outlaw gasped, his bravado evaporating like morning mist. "I was just following orders. Hawkins, he's the one you want." "I want all of you," Samuel replied calmly, binding the outlaw's wounds before securing him. "But you're right. About one thing, Hawkins will learn his lesson last." He left Mexican Joe tied to the tree, knowing the night creatures would keep him afraid but unharmed until morning. In the distance, Samuel heard the sound of horses, Hawkins and the escaped elder Tanner regrouping, no doubt. They would be desperate now, their fear making them dangerous. But fear also made men stupid, and Samuel knew how to use that. He moved through his hunting ground with practiced ease, laying false trails, setting more traps, and always staying just close enough to keep his prey on edge. Each snap of a twig, each rustle of leaves, would wear down their nerves until they saw Cherokee warriors in every shadow. His grandfather's training had prepared him for nights like this. A true hunter knows that patience is his strongest weapon. Let fear do your work for you. Samuel checked his arrows, touched the medicine pouch at his belt, and melted back into the darkness. The night was still young, and there were more lessons to teach before dawn. The midnight hour found Jack Hawkins and the elder Tanner brother huddled in a small clearing, their nerves frayed by the endless darkness. Every shadow held a threat, every whisper of wind carried the possibility of death. They had managed to find each other after the initial attack, but their reunion brought little comfort. "He ain't human," Tanner muttered, cradling his wounded hand. "Way he moves, way he thinks, it ain't natural." His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, seeing painted warriors in every patch of darkness. From his hidden position in the trees, Samuel began his psychological assault. He started with sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping on hollow wood, like distant war drums. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing neither louder nor softer, but remaining just present, enough to set teeth on edge. "Shut up!" Hawkins hissed at the darkness, his silver-plated revolver shaking in his grip. "You hear me, Redskin? You ain't scaring nobody!" Samuel's response was to begin the death song his grandfather had taught him, a low, haunting melody that floated through the trees like mist. The words were ancient Cherokee, speaking of warriors and justice, of debts paid in blood and honor restored. He didn't expect the outlaws to understand the words, but some meanings transcend language. "What's he saying?" Tanner's voice cracked. "What's he calling down on us?" Samuel shifted position silently, letting his voice seem to move around the clearing. He added another element, the subtle shake of a ceremonial rattle, its dry sound, like the warning of a serpent. His grandfather's teachings echoed in his mind. "Fear is like poison in the blood. Let them feel it spreading." The outlaws' nerves continued to unravel. They fired at shadows, wasting precious ammunition. Each shot illuminated their position, while Samuel remained invisible, a ghost in the darkness. He used their own paranoia against them, letting the natural sounds of the night fuel their terror. "We gotta make a run for it," Tanner finally broke, his face slick with sweat despite the cool night air. "He's playing with us, Jack, like a cat with mice." "Shut your mouth," Hawkins snarled, but his own fear was evident in the tremor of his voice. "He's just one man, one Indian farmer who got lucky." Samuel chose that moment to loose an arrow, deliberately grazing Hawkins' hat. The outlaw leader dropped to the ground, firing wildly into the trees. "Come out and fight fair," he screamed into the darkness. "Fair?" Samuel's voice seemed to come from the air itself. "Was it fair when you burned that family's barn? When you broke old man Watson's arm? When you slapped a peaceful farmer working his land?" Each question was punctuated by an arrow thudding into the ground, forming a circle around the terrified outlaws. "Please," Tanner whimpered, his earlier bravado completely shattered. "We'll leave. Never come back. I swear it." "Too late for promises," Samuel replied, now seemingly behind them. When they spun, there was only darkness. The time for choices was at sundown. Another arrow flew, this one taking Tanner in the leg. The outlaw fell, screaming, as Hawkins finally broke. He ran blindly through the woods, leaving his wounded companion behind. Just as Samuel had planned, he emerged from the shadows near the fallen Tanner, his painted face catching a shaft of moonlight. The outlaw stared up at him with the terror of a man seeing his own death approaching. But Samuel simply bound his wound and secured him like the others. "You'll live," he told the trembling man, "to tell others what happened here. But your boss?" He looked in the direction Hawkins had fled. "He has more lessons to learn before this night is done." The death song continued to echo through the trees as Samuel melted back into the darkness, following Hawkins' panicked trail. The hunt was nearly over, but the most important lesson was yet to be taught. Jack Hawkins stumbled through the darkness, his legendary composure shattered like a mirror hitting stone. His clothes were torn from crashing through brush, his face scratched by low-hanging branches. The silver-plated revolver, once a symbol of his authority, now felt useless in his trembling hand. Behind him, the haunting echo of that death song still carried on the wind. He'd lost everything in the space of a few hours. His gang, his reputation, and now, his nerve. The great Jack Hawkins, terror of 3 territories, reduced to running blindly through an Indian farmer's land like a scared rabbit. The irony might have made him laugh if he wasn't so terrified. "Think, damn you," he muttered to himself, trying to get his bearings. The moon offered just enough light to betray him, casting strange shadows that seemed to move with purpose. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be death approaching on silent feet. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, and Hawkins spun, firing one of his precious remaining bullets at nothing. The gunshot's echo had barely faded when an arrow hissed past his ear, so close he felt the wind of its passage. His nerve broke completely then, and he ran again, no longer caring about direction or dignity. He found himself at the edge of a small clearing where the moonlight revealed a sight that stopped him cold. Mexican Joe lay propped against a tree, arrows pinning his sleeves to the bark, his hands bandaged but useless. The man's eyes were wide with terror, darting back and forth like a trapped animal's. "Joe!" Hawkins hissed, moving closer. "Where is he? Which way did he go?" Mexican Joe's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "Which way?" "He's everywhere, Jack. Eyes in the dark, arrows in the wind. We never should have touched his land. Never should have—" His words cut off in a strangled gasp as another arrow thudded into the tree between them. "A wise observation," Samuel's voice drifted from the shadows. "Pity you didn't reach that understanding at sundown." Hawkins fired toward the voice, but hit only air. His gun clicked empty, the last bullet gone. With trembling hands, he reached for his spare ammunition, only to find the pouch missing, lost somewhere in his panicked flight through the woods. "Looking for these?" Samuel's voice came from behind him. Hawkins spun to see his bullets scattered across the ground, catching the moonlight like fallen stars. "Your weapons won't help you anymore. What do you want?" Hawkins screamed into the darkness, his composure completely shattered. "Money? I got money. Name your price." The answer came as another arrow, pinning Hawkins' empty gun to a nearby tree. "You still don't understand," Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "This isn't about money. This is about respect, about consequences, about justice." Hawkins broke and ran again, leaving his prized silver-plated revolver behind. He crashed through the underbrush like a wounded buffalo, all pretense of stealth abandoned. Behind him, he could hear that damned death song starting again, following him like his own shadow. In his blind panic, he didn't see the tripwire until it was too late. The ground disappeared beneath his feet, and he found himself suspended upside down, swinging like a caught fish. As he twisted in the air, he saw Samuel emerge from the shadows, bow in hand, face painted with symbols that seemed to move in the moonlight. "Please," Hawkins whimpered, all his bravado gone. "I'm begging you." Samuel regarded him silently, an arrow nocked but not drawn. "The families you terrorized begged too," he said finally. "The children you frightened, the elders you disrespected, they all begged. Did you listen then?" The night wind carried the sound of wolves howling in the distance, as if nature itself was passing judgment on the fallen outlaw leader. What remained of Jack Hawkins' courage drained away like water through sand, leaving behind only the terrified shell of a man who had finally learned the true meaning of fear. As Samuel stood before the suspended Hawkins, memories stirred in his mind, whispered stories passed around Cherokee campfires, tales of a man who'd made his reputation hunting Native Americans for sport before turning to general outlawry. The pieces began falling into place like autumn leaves. 7 years ago, Samuel said, his voice cutting through the night air, a Cherokee family was found dead near the Kansas border. A father, mother, and 2 children. The official report called it a tragic accident. Hawkins' struggling ceased, his body going still as a corpse. Even in the moonlight, Samuel could see the color drain from his face. "I remember that family," Samuel continued, circling his captured prey. "The father was my cousin, James Blackhawk. His wife, Sarah, was expecting their 3rd child. The authorities said their wagon caught fire while they slept, but we knew better. We found tracks. We found shells from a silver-plated revolver. You can't prove nothing," Hawkins spat, but fear had replaced the defiance in his voice. "That was a long time ago." Samuel's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Prove? This isn't a white man's court, Hawkins. This is Cherokee justice. The land remembers. The spirits remember." He touched the ceremonial paint on his face, the symbols of his ancestors glowing faintly in the moonlight. "And now you'll remember too." Images flashed through Samuel's mind. The burned wagon he'd discovered all those years ago, the small bodies laid out like broken dolls, the sheriff who'd dismissed the evidence with a wave of his hand. His grandfather had counseled patience, then saying, "The time for justice will come. The spirits will guide you to it." It wasn't personal, Hawkins said, his words tumbling out like scared rabbits. They were just Indians. Everyone was hunting Indians back then. Had to clear the territory for civilization, didn't we? It was practically legal. Samuel's arrow flew, slicing a thin line across Hawkins' cheek. Just Indians? Another arrow, another cut on the opposite cheek. Like I'm just an Indian farmer, like they were just children. "I've changed," Hawkins screamed, blood trickling down his face. "I don't hunt Indians no more. Just regular robbery now. Honest work." "Honest work?" Samuel's voice carried echoes of ancient thunder. "Like burning that family's barn last month? Like breaking old man Watson's arm? You haven't changed, Hawkins. You've just changed targets." The outlaw leader began to sob, his tears mixing with the blood on his cheeks. "What are you going to do to me?" Samuel drew another arrow, its tip gleaming in the moonlight. "I'm going to teach you what my grandfather taught me, about respect, about consequences, about the weight of your actions." He paused, letting the words sink in. And then I'm going to make sure you live to share those lessons with others." "Others?" Hawkins asked, confusion mixing with his fear. "Yes," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "Because you're going to become a warning, Hawkins. Every time someone sees your scars, hears your story, they'll learn what happens when you mistake a Cherokee warrior's patience for weakness, when you forget that some debts don't fade with time." In the distance, an owl called 3 times. A sign his grandfather had taught him meant the spirits were watching, waiting for justice to be served. Samuel nocked another arrow, the bowstring humming with ancient purpose. The night was far from over, and there were still many lessons to teach. The moon had reached its zenith, casting silver light across Samuel's land. He'd left Hawkins secured but conscious, wanting the outlaw leader to feel every second of the night's weight. Now, as he walked the boundaries of his property, Samuel felt the presence of his ancestors growing stronger with each step. This wasn't just farmland, though few outside his people knew its true significance. His grandfather had chosen this plot deliberately, recognizing the markers that only a trained eye could see. The ancient oak at the north corner, its branches reaching toward the stars like pleading hands. The natural spring to the east, its waters carrying whispers of old songs. And beneath the soil itself, the bones of warriors who had fought and died protecting their people generations ago. The land knows its guardians, his grandfather had told him on the day they'd first walked. These acres together. It remembers those who bled for it, those who honored it, those who understood its sacred nature. Samuel had been young then, more interested in farming than fighting, but even he had felt the power sleeping in the earth beneath his feet. He paused at a seemingly unremarkable spot near the edge of his cornfield. Here, just inches below the surface, lay the war club of a great Cherokee chief, buried with ceremony and prayer. His grandfather had shown him its location, but warned him never to disturb it unless the need was dire. "Some weapons," the old man had said, "are meant to rest until the land itself calls for their use." The night wind carried the scent of sage and sweetgrass, plants Samuel had carefully tended in his mother's garden. Their presence was no accident. They were part of the land's protection, just as he was. Each herb, each tree, each blade of grass played its role in maintaining the balance between the physical world and the spirit realm. From his vantage point, Samuel could see the clearing where Hawkins hung suspended. The outlaw leader had unknowingly chosen to make his last stand on one of the most sacred spots on the property, a burial ground for medicine men and spiritual leaders. Perhaps the spirits themselves had guided his panicked flight, ensuring justice would be served on hallowed ground. A wolf's howl echoed across the land, followed by another, then another. Samuel recognized their voices. Not ordinary wolves, but spirit guides his grandfather had told him would appear in times of great need. They were calling him, drawing him toward the ancient oak where his grandfather had first taught him the warrior's path. As he walked, the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. The moonlight took on an otherworldly quality, and shadows moved in ways that defied natural law. His grandfather had prepared him for nights like this, when the veil between worlds grew thin, and the ancestors made their presence known. Near the oak, Samuel knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. He felt the heartbeat of the land itself, strong and steady, matching the rhythm of the death song he'd been singing throughout the night. This was why the outlaws could never understand the true nature of their transgression. They saw only dirt and trees, failing to recognize the sacred bond between the land and its chosen protectors. Standing, Samuel removed the medicine pouch from his belt. Inside were herbs and sacred items his grandfather had helped him gather and bless, tools for communing with the spirit world. Tonight, he would need their power not just to defeat Hawkins, but to cleanse the land of the darkness the outlaws had brought with them. The wind picked up, carrying with it the voices of his ancestors. They spoke of justice, of balance restored, of debts paid in full. Samuel added his own voice to theirs, a prayer in ancient Cherokee that seemed to make the very trees tremble. I am the land's guardian, as my father was, and his father before him. Tonight I ask for the strength of all who came before, all who bled upon this sacred soil, all who understood the price and power of protecting what is holy. Guide my hands, steady my heart, and let justice be served in accordance with the old ways. The response came immediately, a surge of energy that made his painted symbols glow like embers in the darkness. The land had awakened fully now, and it demanded resolution. Samuel gathered his weapons and turned back toward where Hawkins waited. The time had come to end this, not just as a warrior, but as a keeper of sacred traditions that reached back into the mists of time. As Samuel approached the clearing where Hawkins hung suspended, movement in the tree line caught his attention. Years of training kept him from reacting visibly, but his senses heightened instantly. These weren't the spectral shapes he'd been seeing all night. These were solid, real, and familiar. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, their faces bearing the same ceremonial paint as his own. Samuel recognized them immediately. John Running Wolf, Thomas Whitecloud, and David Strongbow, Cherokee warriors from neighboring territories. Each man carried traditional weapons and moved with the silent grace that spoke of lifelong training. "Brother," Running Wolf spoke softly in Cherokee, "we felt the land's call. The spirits are restless tonight." Samuel nodded in acknowledgement. These men had trained under his grandfather as well, learning the old ways, keeping the warrior traditions alive in secret, while the white man's world thought them tamed and civilized. "This one's crimes run deeper than we knew," Whitecloud added, gesturing toward Hawkins. 7 families in the past year alone, 3 Cherokee, 2 Creek, 1 Choctaw, and 1 white family who tried to help them. Always the same pattern: harassment, torture, then fire to hide the evidence. Hawkins, hearing multiple voices speaking in Cherokee, began to struggle again in his bonds. "How many of you devils are out there?" he shouted, fear making his voice crack. "This is supposed to be civilized territory now." "Civilized?" Strongbow spat the word like a curse. "Is it civilized to burn children in their sleep, to torture elders for sport?" He stepped into the moonlight, letting Hawkins see the burn scars that covered half his face. "Remember me, murderer? 2 springs ago, when you left me for dead in my burning home." Samuel's hand shot out, stopping Strongbow from moving closer to Hawkins. "Brother," he said firmly, "this night is about justice, not vengeance. The spirits will guide us." Running Wolf produced a leather pouch, much like Samuel's own. "We brought the sacred herbs," he said, "and word from the elders. They've given their blessing for the old rituals to be observed. This man's crimes must be answered in the traditional way." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the night air. The old rituals hadn't been performed in decades, ceremonies of justice that predated white man's law, handled by warriors trained in both physical and spiritual combat. They were reserved for the gravest offenses against the people and the land itself. "Each of us has a claim against him," Whitecloud said quietly. "Each of us has lost family to his cruelty, but you found him first, brother. The spirits guided him to your land. The choice must be yours." Samuel looked at each of his fellow warriors in turn, seeing in their eyes the same fire that burned in his own heart. They weren't just seeking revenge for past wrongs. They were standing as guardians of their people's future, ensuring that men like Hawkins would learn there were consequences to their actions. "Please," Hawkins whimpered, the presence of multiple Cherokee warriors shattering what remained of his courage. "I've got family too. A sister in St. Louis, children who need their father." "Like my children needed their father?" Strongbow demanded, his scarred face twisted in grief and rage. "Like all the families you destroyed needed their loved ones?" Samuel raised his hand for silence, and both Hawkins and the warriors fell quiet. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. He could feel the land itself waiting, the spirits watching, generations of ancestors holding their breath to see if the old ways would be honored. The sacred herbs burned in a small fire at the center of the clearing, their smoke carrying prayers skyward in thin, twisting ribbons. Samuel and his fellow warriors stood in a circle around the flames, their painted faces transformed by the dancing light. The night had grown preternaturally still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. From his bonds, Hawkins watched in growing terror as shapes began to form in the smoke, warrior figures from ages past, their forms shifting and flowing. Like water, the rational part of his mind screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was just fear and firelight playing tricks. But deep in his soul, where truth cannot be denied, he knew he was witnessing something beyond his understanding. "They come," Running Wolf whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The ancestors gather to witness." Samuel felt their presence growing stronger with each passing moment. These weren't just vague spiritual impressions. These were the warriors who had trained his grandfather and their grandfathers before them. He recognized them from stories passed down through generations. Great Bear, the legendary tracker who could follow a trail 3 days old through a storm. Silent Hawk, whose arrows never missed their mark. Thunderhorse, whose war cry could shake the mountains themselves. The smoke figures began to move with purpose, circling the clearing in a slow, deliberate dance. Each warrior carried the weapons of his time. Stone axes, war clubs, bows that had fought against enemies long forgotten. Their footsteps left no marks on the earth, but the energy of their presence made the air itself feel thick and heavy. Old ones speak," White Cloud translated, his eyes distant as he listened to voices only he could hear clearly. "They say this man's crimes have disturbed the balance. The land cries out for restoration." Strongbow removed a bundle wrapped in ancient deerskin from his medicine pouch. Inside lay 4 arrowheads, each carved from different stone and blessed by different tribes. "The chief sent these," he explained. "Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, and white man's steel. All the peoples this murderer has wronged must be represented in his judgment." Samuel took the arrowheads, feeling their weight not just in his hand, but in his spirit. Each one carried the prayers and pain of its people. Each demanded justice in its own way. He began attaching them to arrows, speaking the ancient blessings his grandfather had taught him. The spectral warriors drew closer, their forms becoming more distinct. Samuel could see the paint patterns on their faces, recognized designs that hadn't been used in generations. Some of them bore wounds from their final battles, arrows protruding from ghostly flesh, war clubs frozen in mid-swing. Hawkins began to sob, all pretense of bravado shattered by what he was witnessing. "This ain't real," he kept muttering. "Can't be real." "It is more real than anything you have ever known," Samuel told him, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You wanted to teach an Indian farmer about civilization. Now you will learn about justice from those who understood its true meaning long before your people arrived on these shores." The ancestral warriors raised their spectral weapons in salute, acknowledging Samuel as their chosen instrument of justice. The very air seemed to pulse with their combined power, making the ceremonial paint on the living warriors' faces glow with an inner light. "It is time," Running Wolf announced as the moon reached its highest point. "The spirits have gathered. The ancestors stand ready. The old ways must be honored." Samuel stepped forward, the blessed arrows in his quiver humming with combined spiritual energy of 4 people's justice. Tonight, under the watching eyes of generations of warriors, he would remind the world that the old ways were not dead, merely sleeping, and Hawkins would become a living testament to the price of awakening them. Thunder rolled across the Oklahoma Territory, though no natural clouds filled the sky. The full moon cast its silver light through a gathering mist that seemed to rise from the earth itself, transforming Samuel's farm into an otherworldly battleground. The ancestral warriors had formed a wide circle around the clearing, their spectral forms casting no shadows despite the moonlight. Samuel cut Hawkins down from his suspended position, letting the outlaw leader fall heavily to the ground. The man's legs were too numb to support him, forcing him to crawl like a wounded snake in the dirt. "Get up," Samuel commanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "If you're to face justice, you'll face it on your feet." Hawkins struggled, upright, swaying like a drunk. His eyes darted frantically between the 4 living warriors and the ghostly figures that surrounded them. The ceremonial fire cast strange shadows across his fear-twisted features. "You want to fight?" Hawkins asked, his voice cracking. "That's what this is all about? Fine, give me a gun. Let's settle this like men." Running Wolf laughed, the sound as cold as winter wind. "Like men? You mean like when you shot children in their sleep? Like when you burned elders in their homes?" "The white man's weapons have no place in this ceremony," White Cloud added, his painted face stern in the firelight. "This is older justice, truer justice." Samuel stepped forward, holding his grandfather's bow. "You will be given a chance to fight, to run, to survive. More chance than you gave your victims." He gestured to the dark tree line that surrounded the clearing. "The hunting grounds await. If you can reach the creek's edge before my arrows find you, you're free to go." Strongbow moved to protest, but Samuel silenced him with a look. This was the old way, giving even the worst criminals a warrior's chance, letting the spirits themselves guide the arrows of justice. The spectral warriors began their death song. Anew, their otherworldly voices rising and falling like wind through ancient caves. The very air seemed to vibrate with the power of their presence, making the ceremonial fire dance and flare. "When the song ends," Samuel explained, "you run. Use whatever cunning you possess, whatever strength remains in your legs. But know this, these arrows carry the justice of 4 peoples. The spirits themselves guide their flight." Hawkins looked at the dark trees, measuring the distance with desperate eyes. He was a strong runner, had escaped posses and lawmen across 3 territories, but he'd never been hunted like this, never faced arrows blessed by the dead and guided by ancient powers. The death song grew louder, its rhythm matching the thunder that still rolled overhead. The ghostly warriors began to move, their forms flowing like water, creating a corridor that led from the clearing into the darkness of Samuel's hunting grounds. "Please," Hawkins tried one last time, "I can pay. Anything you want. I've got money. Hidden." "You still don't understand," Samuel cut him off. "This isn't about money. This is about balance, about justice that runs deeper than any man's law." The song reached its crescendo, and Samuel raised his bow, the first blessed arrow nocked. And ready, Hawkins tensed like a cornered animal, his eyes wild with fear and desperate hope. In that moment, with ancestral warriors watching and thunder rolling across a clear sky, Samuel saw not just the murderer before him, but all those like him who thought the old ways were dead, who believed they could harm the innocent without consequence. Tonight's justice would echo far beyond this clearing, far beyond this territory. The death song stopped. Hawkins ran. Hawkins crashed through the underbrush like a wounded buffalo, all thought of stealth abandoned in his desperate flight. Behind him, Samuel moved like a shadow through the trees, each step placed with the precision of a lifetime's training. The scene, spectral warriors flowed alongside them, their ghostly forms passing through solid objects as they kept pace with the chase. Thunder continued to roll across the cloudless sky, each boom making Hawkins stumble in terror. The blessed arrows in Samuel's quiver hummed with spiritual energy, eager to fly, to bring justice to a man who had evaded it for far too long. The first arrow flew, its arrowhead forged from white man's steel, singing through the night air. It caught Hawkins's sleeve, pinning it to a tree trunk for just long enough to make him lose his balance. He ripped free, leaving part of his shirt behind, but the brief delay cost him precious seconds. "You can't run from the spirits, Hawkins," Samuel's voice carried on the wind. "Every step you take is on sacred ground. The land itself rises against you." As if in response to these words, roots seemed to reach up from the earth to tangle Hawkins' feet. Branches whipped at his face, thorns tore at his clothes. The spectral warriors glided past him, their ancient faces showing neither mercy nor malice, only the certainty of justice long delayed. The second arrow, tipped with creekstone, struck the ground between Hawkins' feet as he tried to change direction. He stumbled again, this time falling hard against a boulder. When he pushed himself up, the moonlight revealed the rock face was carved with ancient Cherokee symbols. Another reminder that he was being judged by powers older than his understanding. Running Wolf, White Cloud, and Strongbow had taken up positions around the hunting ground, their voices joining the ancestral death song that still echoed through the trees. They were not there to intervene. This was Samuel's hunt, Samuel's justice to deliver, but their presence helped maintain the spiritual energy that made this night possible. Hawkins reached a small clearing and spotted the creek's edge in the distance. Hope flared in his chest. He'd covered nearly half the distance to safety, but as he started to run again, the third arrow, decorated with Choctaw stone, split the night. It caught him in the leg, not deep enough to cripple, but enough to make him cry out in pain and fear. "That was for the children you murdered," Samuel's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "For the innocents you stole, for the families you destroyed." The outlaw leader pulled the arrow free and threw it aside, but the wound burned like fire. The blessed arrowhead had left more than a physical mark. It carried the weight of his sins, the judgment of the spirits themselves. Lightning flashed in the clear sky as Samuel emerged from the shadows ahead of Hawkins, blocking his path. The ceremonial paint on his face glowed with an inner light, and the spirits of ancient warriors gathered behind him like a storm cloud about to break. "Please," Hawkins gasped, blood running down his leg. "I understand now. I see what I did wrong." "Show mercy, like the mercy you showed others," Samuel asked, fitting the final arrow, tipped with Cherokee stone, to his bow. "This isn't about vengeance, Hawkins. This is about balance. About ensuring that men like you learn there are consequences, that the old ways still have power." The spectral warriors raised their ghostly weapons in salute as Samuel drew back his bowstring. This last arrow carried the combined justice of all four peoples, Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, and yes, even the white man's law. In its flight would be the voices of all those who had suffered at Hawkins' hands, all those who had cried out for justice. Thunder cracked overhead one final time as Samuel prepared to loose the arrow that would end this night of judgment. The spirits of his ancestors stood ready to witness, and the very land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for balance to be restored. The final arrow flew with purpose, carrying the combined justice of four peoples and countless spirits. Time seemed to slow as it cut through the night air, trailing ethereal light like a shooting star. Hawkins watched it come with the terrible knowledge that no matter how he moved, this arrow would find its mark. The spirits themselves guided its flight. The arrow struck true, piercing Hawkins' shoulder and pinning him to an ancient oak tree. The same tree, Samuel knew, where his grandfather had first taught him the warrior's ways. The outlaw's scream echoed through the forest, but it wasn't just physical pain that made him cry out. The blessed arrowhead carried spiritual weight, forcing Hawkins to feel the pain of every person he had ever harmed. "Let him feel it all," Running Wolf's voice carried from the darkness. "Every tear, every cry, every moment of fear and suffering he inflicted on others." The spectral warriors drew closer, their ghostly forms more solid now than they had been all night. They formed a circle around Hawkins, each one holding up a mirror made of moonlight and mist. In each reflection, Hawkins saw his crimes played. Back to him, the families he'd terrorized, the homes he'd burned, the lives he'd destroyed. "This is your judgment," Samuel declared, stepping forward with his grandfather's knife drawn. "Not death. Death would be too simple, too quick. Instead, you will live, marked forever by this night, carrying scars that will remind everyone who sees them of the justice that found you." White Cloud and Strongbow moved to hold Hawkins steady as Samuel began his work. With precise strokes, he carved Cherokee symbols into the outlaw's chest, ancient words for justice, remembrance, and warning. Each cut was shallow, designed to heal but leave clear scars. All the while, the spiritual energy continued to course through Hawkins' body, burning the memory of this night into his very soul. "These marks tell a story," Samuel explained, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "They speak of a man who thought himself above the old ways, who believed he could hurt the innocent without consequence. They warn others that the spirits still watch, that justice still finds its mark, that some debts must be paid in flesh and bone." Thunder rolled one final time as Samuel completed his work. The spectral warriors raised their weapons in approval, their forms beginning to fade. Like morning mist, they had witnessed justice being served in the old way, had seen balance restored to their lands. "You will live, Jack Hawkins," Samuel declared, cleaning his knife on a cloth. "You will live to show those scars, to tell this story, and every time someone asks about these marks, you will remember this night. You will remember that the old ways are not dead, that some powers should never be awakened, that true justice comes not from law books, but from the very land itself." Running, Wolf stepped forward with a medicine pouch. "These herbs will prevent infection, ensure the scars heal clean and clear. You will carry them forever, a living testament to the consequences of disrespecting sacred things." As the medicine was applied, Hawkins remained eerily silent. The spiritual energy had transformed him, burned away his arrogance and cruelty, leaving behind a hollow shell that would slowly fill with the wisdom of hard-learned lessons. His eyes held the look of a man who had glimpsed powers beyond his understanding and would never forget what he had seen. The other warriors began a healing song, their voices carrying through the trees as the first hints of dawn began to lighten. The eastern sky. The spectral forms of their ancestors faded completely, their justice delivered, their power returning to the earth until it would be needed again. Samuel knelt beside the trembling form of his enemy, now transformed into a messenger. "When you leave this place," he said softly, "you will take with you not just scars, but understanding. The next time you see a peaceful farmer working his land, you will remember this night. The next time you think to harm the innocent, you will feel these marks burn. And you will know that somewhere the spirits are watching, waiting, ready to wake again if needed." Hawkins nodded weakly, tears mixing with blood on his face. The man who had terrorized 3 territories was gone, replaced by someone who would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, feeling phantom arrows in the night wind and warning others about the consequences of awakening ancient powers. As the first ray of sun broke over the horizon, Samuel looked to his fellow warriors. "It is done," he said simply. "The balance is restored." The night of judgment was over, but its effects would ripple outward like waves in a pond, carrying the message to all who would listen. The old ways still lived, justice still had teeth, and some debts could only be paid under the watching eyes of ancestors who never truly left their sacred lands. Morning dawned clear and bright over Samuel's farm, the land showing no signs of the supernatural events that had transpired during the night. The cornstalks stood tall and undisturbed, dew glistening on their leaves like tears of relief. Only the scattered remains of the ceremonial fire in the clearing gave any indication that something extraordinary had occurred. Samuel stood on his porch, watching as Sheriff Miller and his deputies collected the outlaws. Hawkins sat silently in the back of the wagon, his eyes distant, the fresh bandages covering his carved chest already telling their own story. The other gang members, retrieved from various points around the property where Samuel had left them bound, couldn't stop staring at their former leader, sensing the profound change in him, but unable to understand its cause. "Quite a night's work," Sheriff Miller commented, standing beside Samuel. The lawman's eyes took in the precise arrows still embedded in various trees, the expertly tied bonds that had held the criminals, and the strange symbols drawn in the dirt. He didn't ask for details. Some things were better left unspoken. Between friends, "The land is peaceful again," Samuel replied simply, rolling his shoulders to ease muscles tired from a night of hunting. Already he could feel himself settling back into the rhythm of farm life, the warrior spirit returning to its slumber until needed again. Running Wolf, White Cloud, and Strongbow had departed as silently as they'd arrived, carrying with them the blessed items and medicines used in the night ceremony. But they had left something behind, a renewed respect for the old ways, a reminder that justice could wear many faces. As the wagon carrying the outlaws disappeared down the trail toward town, Samuel turned to his daily chores. There were crops to tend, animals to feed, and a peaceful life to maintain. Yet something had shifted in the territory's understanding of this quiet Cherokee farmer. Word would spread, as it always did, carried on whispers and knowing looks. The land itself seemed more alive now, more aware. Samuel could feel it as he worked, the sacred ground awakened by the night's events, the ancestors standing closer, to the surface of things. His grandfather had been right. The old ways weren't lost, just sleeping, waiting for those moments when they were needed most. And so Samuel Blackhawk returned to his farming, his weapons cleaned and stored away, his paint washed from his face. But now everyone knew what lay beneath the surface of his calm demeanor, the heart of a warrior, the strength of ancient traditions, and the unwavering commitment to protecting what was sacred. The morning wind carried the promise of autumn, and with it the whispered reminder that some lessons once taught were never forgotten. Justice had been served, balance restored, and the land could rest easy again, knowing its guardians stood ready should the need ever arise.